I'm Saladin Ambar. Welcome to This Moment in Democracy. This episode was recorded on Wednesday, January 18th. Today, I'm speaking with Steve Kornacki. Steve is the National Political Correspondent for MSNBC and a longtime friend of the Eagleton Institute of Politics. We'll talk about the investigation into President Biden's classified documents, the recent series of votes for the Speaker of the House, and we may even cover some NFL news. Let's dive into it. Steve, welcome to This Moment in Democracy, and welcome back to Eagleton, if I might say, even if it's virtually.
Oh, well, thanks. Yeah, even if it is virtually, it's great to be back. I started my career covering New Jersey politics. I always tell people my favorite memories, my favorite stories are from Jersey, and certainly spent plenty of time at Eagleton. So it's a special place to me. So I appreciate you having me on.
Well, it's our pleasure. And, to wit on that Jersey pride front, why don't you share a little bit about your career in journalism and those Jersey Rutgers connections? What was the impetus for you getting involved in journalism to begin with? How did that all start for you?
Sure. Yeah, no, I think I've, going way back, was always sort of interested in politics, and, I would find myself just sort of at a young age, middle school, high school, started following it through the media, reading a lot of newspapers. This was right before the kind of big shift in media where newspapers are now in such decline, and in the internet and social media has taken over so much. But, I'd read as many newspapers as I could. I'd read Time, Newsweek, U.S. News, and sort of got hooked on both politics and political media kind of simultaneously. And so found myself when I graduated from school, wanted to get into it somehow. And I'm from Massachusetts originally, but, I stumbled across it's just one of those things in life that just sort of happens. But I came across this job covering New Jersey state politics and moved down to New Jersey, not knowing much about the state, not knowing much about New Jersey politics. Learned a ton about New Jersey politics in the next three and a half years. And really was the best job I ever had.
Well, I bet you did learn a lot about New Jersey politics. It's sort of unlike any in the nation, very idiosyncratic, but also with a national flavor. It's terrific to know that we can sort of claim you on a second step level, maybe after the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for all the good work you've done over the years. Listen, obviously it's no secret, given all the national exposure you've had since the last several election cycles. You've become a bit of a face for political coverage, election night coverage. How in the heck did you become sort of the face of maybe football coverage a little bit? How do you feel about that? And what's been your experience delving into the world of NFL sports and prognosticating, if you will?
Yeah, it's one of those. I've done it for 3 seasons now. We felt like this is with Sunday Night Football, Football Night in America, the pregame show for Sunday Night Football on NBC. And, they called me up after it was right after the 2020 election. And, my feeling was I'm a fan. I'm a viewer. I watch the NFL every week anyway. I watch Sunday Night Football anyway. And specifically, they were interested in, is there a way to get me involved in the playoff chase? Because that time of year, late November, December, now into early January, you've got the playoff picture just changing, game to game. And I was really interested in doing it just because I'm such a fan of it. Obviously, it's sort of like, dream come true kind of thing. But what I was sensitive to and am and talk to them about, and I think we were all on the same page, was, let's just make sure this is not a gimmick where
right.
It's here's the, kind of like hyper frenetic election guy. And now he's pointing to numbers about football. I want it to be meaningful. And so I think, and I hope that's what we've done with it, where, we pick it up at the end of the season. And the idea is to show you, because we're coming on at, 7:00. So most of the games are done or finishing up at that hour. And it's to show you, okay, coming into the day, here's how the AFC and the NFC top 7 looked, and the chance of each team making the playoffs. Here's how it looks now that the games have been played. Here's what's changed. Here's what it means, for the
right.
And really, I think it flows very well out of the election coverage, where that's a lot of thematically what I'm doing with election coverage. Think of like the 2020 presidential election. We spend the run up to it, Okay, it's what if scenarios. What if Joe Biden wins Wisconsin but loses Pennsylvania? What if Trump wins Arizona but loses Georgia? How does that affect the path to 270 for each of them? What are the different scenarios? What are the different probabilities? So it really, I found it kind of flowed nicely out of that. And like I said, just being a fan and getting a chance to see it from the inside like that's been a great thrill.
Well, I was going to ask if there were any synchronicities and overlaps, but I think you suggest that there are. That the way of thinking about it is maybe related to a little bit of game theory, probability. But you seem to be very much a natural at it, so it's fun to watch you in both spheres of life, politics and football. So I think we all appreciate it. Well, look, I want to turn to something a little bit more serious, given. In my experience as a political science professor and probably countless other Americans watching that House Speaker vote, my goodness, I'd never seen anything like that in my life. I know many have not, people who carefully study this, as do you. Can you help us understand the recent Speaker of the House vote, even as each vote ended and the next one began? No one really seemed to understand or be able to say what the conflict was about. Could you bring some clarity now, a little post hoc, to what happened along the way? What did we learn? Maybe what did you learn during that process?
Yeah, I mean, there aren't many people who can remember anything like it because it's been 100 years since it had gone, past a ballot. And in this one, as you say, went 15. I think part of it is still to be determined. Part of what this speaker's fight did, I think, is it kind of sets the tone for the next 2 years, where the Republicans are going to have a very small majority in the House, smaller than they expected going into the midterm election. And this was a very early, very dramatic statement by a segment of the House Republican Conference, fewer than 24 members, really about 20 members, that when the majority is that small, they have leverage. And they have the ability to slow things down, to bring things to a halt, and to make demands. And in this case, they were willing to hold up the installation of a Republican speaker. And the way the House works is until you have a speaker installed, nothing, like literally nothing else can happen. And so this group picked this as the moment to issue some demands. And it seemed to me that there were what the clarity that I saw over the week was there were two groups, roughly speaking, within those holdouts. One, the majority, and I think the face of them was Chip Roy, Republican from Texas, did have some, I think, some concrete and substantive demands. And what it really boiled down to is a vision of the House where power is decentralized, where a lot of recent speakers, this is Republican and Democratic, had really centralized control of the House within the Speaker's office. And they had sort of created or had mastered kind of controlling different levers of power. A big one being the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee. If any bill is going to come on the floor, it's got to pass through the Rules Committee. It's one of the tools the Speaker in the modern era has used to really kind of pack the Rules Committee with loyalists. The Rules Committee rubber stamps what the Speaker wants, and that's how the Speaker really controls the flow of activity in the House. And these members, the Chip Roy type Republican members, don't want that. Right. They think that inhibits their ability to, attach amendments to bills, for instance, and to get votes on things that the Speaker may not want votes on. And so that was something that they were pushing for, was to sort of decentralize that power. I think they may have succeeded in that. We'll see what that translates into. There's a version of that where I imagine there'd even be Democratic members of the House who, if their party regains the majority, might want something similar because it would empower them in ways that the backbench members haven't been empowered before. But that deal was struck late in the week, at about around 11 or so of the voting, and even then, not all of the holdouts came on board. There were still about a half a dozen left, and I think their issues with McCarthy were much more personal and ultimately. Not enough for them to overcome. He won the speakership not by winning over those final six holdouts and getting them to vote for him. He won it by getting them to vote present. So they will still get to say they didn't actually vote for McCarthy. They never did in all 15 rounds. And again, with a majority that thin for Republicans, 222 seats, those six could be very difficult for McCarthy to deal with in the next 2 years.
Can you share with us what you think this means for the GOP going forward? Fill in the blank. 2 years from now, 5 years from now, the Republican Party is.
Well, that's the unknown. I mean, there's a version of this I think Republicans will tell you, and maybe it's wishful thinking on their part, but there's a version where they kind of got it out of their system here.
Okay.
And they had it all out in public and in the most public way possible, and they emerged from this a little bit more on the same page. But there are big tests you could just see to come. The most obvious one, there'll be others, but the most obvious one is going to be probably sometime this May, June, July, somewhere in there with a debt ceiling. When you reach that point where there's a possibility of a default on the debt. We were there as a country back in the summer of 2011. When Barack Obama was president. Republicans had just taken control of the House, sort of a similar scenario. The Tea Party movement was really the driving, populist force in the Republican Party, and came very close to a default. Back then, a deal was struck at the 11th hour. John Boehner, the Republican speaker, was ultimately able to strike that deal with Barack Obama. It was a deal that made many in the Republican Party back then very upset with John Boehner. Oh, yeah. I think ultimately contributed. It took a few years. It was a slow process, but I think ultimately contributed to to Boehner essentially losing the speakership. He resigned it, but there was a lot of growing discontent with him among Republicans. And I think that was a big moment in it, that debt ceiling fight. Well, okay, how's Kevin McCarthy going to handle it? Because I think you're going to have similar demands being made by Republicans for deep spending cuts that Democrats are going to resist, that's likely to cause a big showdown. And what's McCarthy going to be willing to give in any negotiation with Biden? And secondarily, what's he going to be able to sell to a Republican conference where, if 5 Republicans say no, absolutely not, he's not going to have the votes on his own to deliver something. So, and if he cuts a deal with Democrats, they could oust him. That's the other part of this deal that was reached is, any one member at any time can essentially introduce a no confidence vote on the House Speaker. So, again, if McCarthy is seen by Republicans as being too favorable, too compromise inclined in any debt ceiling negotiations with Democrats, it wouldn't take much to subject him to that. So that's the most obvious test. I think that's coming in a few months, but there'll be other issues as well. And so I think it's a TBD. It's just this very unique dynamic where I think McCarthy and Republicans were going into those midterms, looking at the history of midterm elections and thinking they were going to walk out of there with 240 seats, something like that, a healthy majority where, okay, fine, there might be a dozen, there might be 15 real hardcore members. They can, vote against us on this or that, and we'll still be okay. He's now in a situation where he's got very little margin for error, and that introduces the potential every step of the way for the next 2 years for a lot of headaches for him, at least.
My goodness. Well, we all grew up with the Senate being that way, right? Any one senator could, create utter chaos at a moment's notice. But now it seems that that's where we are with the House, which I don't know, doesn't seem to bode well for democracy. But let's not get that expansive just yet. I want to turn to the Democratic Party and President Biden. And the discovery of these newest classified documents. Do you think they're going to hurt his chances of running for a second term? Do you think his decision making will factor that into the process?
I wonder. And it seems like it's an evolving story. So one of the questions is: are there more? If so, how many? Where? What do we know about what types of materials we're talking about? Does our understanding of this grow? Does the expansiveness of it grow? In the coming days and weeks. So let's see what more we learn about it. Obviously, it create politically, just purely politically, it creates a very complicated situation because Democrats have obviously made such a point here about Donald Trump's conduct when it came to the documents that at Mar-a-Lago, the potential, with that appointment of a special counsel, the potential for prosecution of Trump on those grounds, any move that ends up, if there is any move that ends up being made legally on that front, Obviously you'll have Republicans saying, what about Biden? What about Biden? What about Biden? I'd be curious to see how that kind of tests in public opinion, if that becomes a thing that hurts him, that complicates Democrats. Democrats have felt, it's interesting because coming out of the midterm elections, I think the biggest reason Democrats didn't do that badly at all in the midterms and did much better than anybody expected was the looming presence of Donald Trump. I think it had a lot to do with obviously January 6th, with how he left office, with his refusal to accept the results. It had to do with the raid at Mar-a-Lago this summer. It had to do with all of these Republican candidates in marquee races across the country who were, I think, voicing versions of Trump's claims about 2020, or at least not pushing back against them. It was just very notable to me in the exit polling. Joe Biden was not popular, especially with independent voters. The Democratic Party was not popular, especially with independent voters. But Donald Trump was even less popular. The Republican Party was even less popular. And so I think Democrats emerged from those midterm elections feeling that, they'd had a lot of doubts about Biden those first 2 years politically for all sorts of reasons. But I think they felt there was a feeling among Democrats coming out of there, well, hey, look, if Republicans are going to nominate Trump again in 2024, and that's a big if, hey, maybe nominating Biden would be fine, because ultimately, if it's a referendum, the midterm strongly suggests the public is going to reject, Trump and the Republicans more than Biden and the Democrats. But does something like this document story change that equation at all, or does it not? Because we've seen in the last 5 or 6 years a number of major stories, major political legal dramas that you would in the past have thought would really take a political toll on someone. They haven't. So that's a possibility as well.
Oh, certainly. And in the event, likely or unlikely, that Biden decides not to run, who do you think might be best positioned in the party if he decides to bow out?
And I think that's the other reason why it's hard for me to see him not running. And I think why a lot of Democrats, at least, in the wake of the midterms, were starting to publicly get on board with the idea of Biden running again. It's that if not Biden, who? And I think what Democrats are scared of is the idea of, well, okay, Kamala Harris as the sitting vice president would be the obvious name you'd go to. But there's little evidence that just by getting into the race, she would lock it down. I think it's clear she'd face some challengers. And once you saw this in 2020, when 24 Democratic candidates, I think at one point, were running for the nomination, where one Democrat looks and sees another Democrat running and says, well, if this Democrat's running, why am I not running? And then somebody and it just starts snowballing that way. Before you know it, you got 24 candidates. And I think that worries Democrats that if you lose Biden, who's kind of holding it all together now, even if it's a little bit shaky. If you lose him, do you have a really messy primary and a really divisive primary? And does that end up working? And then if the Republicans, conversely, the Republicans have the potential for a very messy primary as well. But if the Republicans ever, had a surprisingly smooth process and united around somebody, especially I would say if that somebody ended up not being Donald Trump, and meanwhile the Democrats have all these candidates just bashing each other around, that could be a real nightmare for Democrats politically. So I think that the Biden argument to Democrats is, hey, you may think I'm too old, you may think I'm a little shaky out there, but I just had a pretty good midterm given right. What I was up against and given what history says. And if I step aside, who are you going to turn to? And so maybe you want to think, and I think that seems to be his message to Democrats right now. And I think right now it's got a fair amount of purchase with them.
Well, it's a great point. But of course, there's always these wild cards, as you know. We weren't necessarily thinking of Barack Obama back in early 2006 or so in the same way. Are there any stars that emerged, potential stars, is probably the better way to put it, that emerged out of the midterms for Democrats, a Wes Moore, or maybe someone who's been there around a while, a Gretchen Whitmer, who clearly has distinguished herself in Michigan? Any thoughts on people maybe we're not readily thinking about?
Yeah, no, there are a few. Josh Shapiro, who wins the governorship in Pennsylvania. There's a number of Democrats out there you could look at and you could say, oh, that's sort of plausible national material right there. But when I think back to Obama, in the run up to '08. There was a lot of doubt, obviously, that he could beat Hillary Clinton. There were a lot of people that thought she would simply be unbeatable no matter who the Democrat was. But there was also a lot of excitement around Obama coming from that 2004 convention speech. And I think he had, even before he got in the race, he had created a sort of exciting, charismatic, at least to Democrats, national brand. Whether it was going to be enough to beat Hillary, I mean, that was, a lot of people doubted that, but it was clear he was. You look at who else ran in 2008, Chris Dodd, Bill Richardson. It was clear Obama kind of already towered above them stature-wise. I don't see, whether it's Josh Shapiro or Gretchen Whitmer or Gavin Newsom. I see them all kind of stature-wise at about the same level right here, which again that's what helped create that mess for Democrats in 2020 when you had all those candidates. And it was that when you think back to it, I mean, Biden finished, he was buried in Iowa, he was buried in New Hampshire, and there was no clear verdict from Iowa, no clear verdict from New Hampshire. It was sort of looking like Sanders might almost by default get the nomination. But Democratic voters were just all over the place. And then Biden gets that decisive win in South Carolina. And then you see the whole party just kind of looks at him and says, okay, good enough. I guess that's what it'll be. We needed it to be somebody. We need to be pointed towards somebody. But so, I don't know. If not Biden, is there somebody who in a state like South Carolina could get a big win and get the rest of the party on board? I guess that'd be my question. I don't have a good answer to it.
Yeah, it's a great thing to consider going forward. And have we gotten a little too high, or Republican voters, or the intelligentsia got a little too high on Ron DeSantis, perhaps as a successor to Trump? Or do you think folks are generally right in thinking about him as the best potential next standard bearer for the Republican Party?
He makes the most politically, he makes the most sense on paper. Now, whether that translates into actually being able to first of all, I don't know if he's going to run. I don't know if he wants to run against Donald Trump. But I've seen polling that's, shown, hey, if it's DeSantis versus Trump, DeSantis is right there with Trump. I've seen polling that put Trump a fair bit ahead of him. But it's clear in the polling that's out there when you throw a bunch of other names out there as well, a Pompeo, a Mike Pence, a Chris Christie, you include them in the mix. DeSantis is the only one who gets serious traction against Trump at this point. He can point to what he just pulled off in Florida. Republicans are having trouble nationally in the 2022 midterms, yet down in Florida, which I don't think people think of it as a swing state anymore. But again, it was a 2-3 point state the last couple of presidential elections, and he wins it by 20. And he wins, 71% Hispanic Miami-Dade County by double digits. I mean, he's got a lot of things he can point to and tell Republicans. And the basic pitch to Republicans is, I'm giving you Trumpism without all the baggage of Donald Trump. I think, whether you'd have to find an artful way to say that, but that's what he's sort of offering them. So he's the only one I've seen who I think can a huge part of the party base seems to want Trumpism. And I think he could plausibly offer that to them, but I don't know how many of them want it without Donald Trump, and I think that would be tested. And I think the problem there too, potentially for DeSantis or for anybody who gets traction against Trump, is let's say DeSantis runs, let's say Trump runs, let's say DeSantis actually beats him. I imagine that's a bitter primary fight, potentially a long one. Potentially Trump wins a bunch of states, DeSantis wins a bunch of states, DeSantis ends up with more delegates. Based on how he handled 2020, I don't, be hard pressed to say Trump just takes the loss and walks away.
Right. Not going quietly.
Right. And so if you're DeSantis and you're thinking this through, even if you think you can beat Trump, do you think you're going to beat him in a way that you get a clear, united Republican Party behind you in the fall? Or do you beat him in a way where you got to run against a Democrat in the fall and you got to run against Donald Trump taking shots at you and threatening to run independent and all the? I think that's a consideration for him too.
Wow. And, that is a scenario I have not pondered, but you're right. There's no way Donald Trump would go quietly into the night if it were anything remotely approaching a contested primary season. So yeah, something to think about. Hey, listen, Steve, I'd love for you to just share a moment, thought on the passing of Jim Florio. If I can bring it back to New Jersey. We lost Governor Florio not that long ago here. Can you share any specifics on your connection to him, but also maybe his legacy in American politics, certainly in New Jersey? That would be really, I think, terrific for our audience.
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, a major figure in modern, New Jersey history, and somebody who I got to know him. I started covering New Jersey politics a little less than a decade after he left office, but he was still very much around. He had actually just run for the Senate in 2000. He lost the Democratic primary to John Corzine in 2000. That was his last political campaign, but he was still very present in the state. Always struck me as somebody. He totally fit the definition of a policy wonk. He took whether you agreed with him or not, he took public policy very seriously. He did his homework on everything. He was well versed on any issue that touched New Jersey. He was extremely thoughtful, and the obviously the legacy of his governorship, I think, will always be the tax increase that cost him politically, and I think pretty clearly cost him the governorship. Although he came, as Democrats would be quick to remind you, he went from an approval rating that was under 20% at one point after that tax increase. I think in 1990, his approval rating fell under 20%. And he came within about 30,000 votes of winning re-election and winning a second term as governor. And so somebody, I've heard the claim made that the argument made that Florio won the campaign in 1993 against Christine Todd Whitman, but he lost the election. That he sort of overperformed expectations and she underperformed expectations, even though she ended up with a few more votes than he did and ended up becoming the governor. But he was somebody. All my dealings with him, he just always struck me as somebody who really thought deeply about issues, thought deeply about public policy, and took it very seriously. And again, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, to take the specific ideology away from it, I think his approach to it is a great model. It was a great model for people on both sides.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And before I let you go, thank you again for being so gracious with your time. We realize that sleep is always an important part of your life, and rest and time away from MSNBC and your other duties around the country. We're really thankful to have you here. You want to share with us, if not a pick for this coming weekend, but maybe who do you like going into the big game, the Super Bowl? What do you got going on, Steve? Who do you like?
You know what?
Give me AFC, NFC. What do you got?
We're going into the divisional round. Well, I mean, this is where my heart and my head differ. I loved watching the Jacksonville comeback against the Chargers. Trevor Lawrence, Jekyll and Hyde, I would love to see Jacksonville keep it going somehow, go into Kansas City and pull off the upset this weekend. It's hard to see, although Kansas City has sort of been playing down to its opponent's level, I think, the last month of the season. But otherwise, I kind of look at it. I look at all the underdogs this weekend, and I think the Giants have a real shot against. I mean, watch somebody listening to this a week from now say Kornacki went 0 for 4. Right. But I think the Giants can give Philadelphia a game. I think Dallas can go out to San Francisco and give them a game. I think Cincinnati's playing the Bills. They had that suspended game, obviously, because of that horrible situation. But, remember, Cincinnati was up in that game when that happened. And now they got to go play at Buffalo. But I wonder if that'll motivate them a little bit. So I don't know. I'll be pulling for the Jags. I think that one's the least likely. But those other three underdogs, I just think are all gonna. I'd be surprised if all three of them don't make them real games.
Well, terrific. Well, you've worn many hats for this conversation. As always, you knocked it out the park, if I can mix metaphors here with sports. So thank you so much for joining us on this moment in democracy. Steve, it's been really wonderful having you. Good to see you. Thanks again.
You too. No, thank you for having me. And I love it. Politics, New Jersey football. I think we hit it all.
Amen. Today's podcast has been brought to you by the Eagleton Institute of Politics. Eagleton is a nonpartisan research unit of Rutgers University, New Brunswick. This Moment in Democracy was made possible in part by the generosity of Gerald and Kiko Harvey and Eagleton's many supporters. To support Eagleton's work or sign up for its newsletter, click the links in the description. To learn more about the Institute, visit eagleton.rutgers.edu and follow Eagleton on social media.